Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Global Interdependence Center Executive Briefing. I'm Bill Kennedy. I'm the Vice Chair of Programming for the GIC. Let me take a second to welcome you. We miss you. We hope you and your families and your loved ones are healthy and safe. And we really look forward to that hopeful day when we can all be together and the GIC resumes its regular programs of meetings, conferences, and delegation trips. This is the third executive briefing in our series titled Analyzing Pandemics. We'd like to dedicate today's event to healthcare workers in our communities, our states, around the country, and indeed around the world. You have been the true frontline warriors in this battle against COVID-19, and we thank you. So today, we're going to focus on the geopolitical implications of the pandemic. Before I introduce Dr. Friedman, I want to take a little audience participation. We'd like to ask you to take a quick survey. You're going to see 6 questions pop up on your screen. We'd ask that you take about 10 seconds to read the question, then select your answer by hovering your cursor over the button and click the answer of your choice. So if we can get started with the first question. The world is globally interdependent. 2 years from now, by 2022, will the world be more or less interdependent? Next question. If self-isolating at home, how long has it been since you last went out for food or supplies? Has it been a day, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or longer? Question 3. When do you expect an end to social distancing and business closures? Is it May to June, in July to August, fourth quarter of this year, or the first quarter of next year? Question 4. So this is assuming not a retiree. What is the economic impact on you as a result of stay-at-home rules or the business disruptions? And question 5. So the US spends more on healthcare than any other country in the world. 2018 numbers, $3.7 trillion spent on healthcare, which is 18% of the economy and about $11,000 per person. So the question is, do you expect future healthcare spending to increase, stay about the same, or decline? In question 6, our final question. So leaders and politicians can sometimes act contrary to their ideologies or the ideological leanings. One example of this was in the 1970s when the US would never engage with China, but in fact, Nixon surprised the world by traveling to China, and that led to a popular phrase, only China or only Nixon can go to China. So the question we would ask is, could President Trump actually become an advocate for Medicare for all? Great, thank you for participating in the survey. And so we will collect everyone's answers and we'll show you the results toward the end of our program today. So we're thrilled to have joining us Dr. George Friedman, who is the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures, a company dedicated to forecasting the course of the international system. Dr. Friedman is an internationally recognized strategist on global affairs who's been called the creator of the field of geopolitical forecasting. He's a New York Times bestselling author. His most recent book is The Storm Before the Calm, This actually came out in February, and in this book, Dr. Friedman analyzes and explores the United States' future through two important cycles, an institutional cycle and a socioeconomic cycle. His most popular book is titled The Next 100 Years, and it's only more popular than the new book because it's been around in publication for 11 years, but also very amazing prescience of the predictions that Dr. Friedman included in that publication. We encourage you to take a look at both of these books. They're available through the Geopolitical Futures website. You can access them through the GIC website or at an online book retailer near you. So George, we welcome you to the GIC executive briefing. Over to you, sir.
Well, I have one advice to everyone. Never publish a book on February 25th, which is the day everything shut down, including all my interviews. And so this is the book that sank to the bottom of the ocean and maybe will reemerge. The nice thing is that I discussed the future of the United States without once mentioning the COVID crisis, so nobody noticed that omission. So let's talk about the situation right now. At the moment, there is no international system. All the places that you have been obsessed with, Brexit, US relation with China, and so on, are on hold because no one can really define what the players are going to look like and when they're going to look like it. The country that's the most important, of course, is the United States. It's the most important because it's the largest importer in the world. As the largest importer in the world, it can influence the behavior of other countries most powerfully, or in turn get manipulated by those countries. But it is never a matter of unimportance of how the United States is doing. If, for example, we emerged from this in a situation where the United States was unable to export large amounts, the situation in Germany, the situation in China, many other countries would change. If this is a road bump and we come back very powerfully and they're shattered, if you will, well, our own ability to purchase becomes less important than our ability to export. There are many questions, but when you're the largest country in the world economically, when you are the largest importer in the world, and you have the only global military, everybody watches what you're doing. And at the moment, nobody's watching us because they're too busy watching themselves. So we've had a great insularity that's built up in the world and nationalism. Make no mistake that Germany is going to follow the policy on finance it has to follow, whatever the consequences for the Italians. The Eastern Europeans are joyously happy. They weren't admitted to the Eurozone, and they have their own currencies, and that makes them very happy. The Chinese are engaged in an invisible internal battle over how badly Xi screwed up and how much better somebody else would do it. Do not, for the moment, believe Xi is in a powerful position between his mismanagement of the United States during the import issue and his poor management of this, not that anybody could manage it well. His enemies are now moving. Therefore, in order to understand this crisis, we have to understand the United States. To understand the United States, we have to take a look at the structures in the United States and how they're functioning. At this moment, there are 4 structures that matter. The first is the medical. The second is the economic, of course. The third is the social, our relationship to each other. And the fourth is the military. I throw the military in because should the situation in the supply chain weaken substantially beyond this, it will be the military that has the reserve manpower to sustain it, not to mention the trucks. Also, in looking at the medical, we should always remember that the center of biological defense is someplace called Fort Detrick, which is located in Maryland, right outside of Frederick. And at Fort Detrick, you have the major American research center to the kind of event that's happened. And one of the things that's happening inside the medical community is foundering. They were as taken by surprise as everyone else was. In retrospect, everybody knows that everybody should have known 2 months before or 1 month before. Well, I'm pretty good, and I didn't know, and I didn't have a political axe to grind. So the first thing to understand is that we are in a very different situation medically. We've had viruses before: polio, Spanish flu, diphtheria, cholera. But we have taken a different approach to this one from any other one. And it came this way. The disease broke out. We had watched it in China, and we really didn't know what it was or where it was going, and the Chinese were not telling us very much that we needed to know. And we came here, and it arrived. There was no vaccine. There was no mitigation. No, take 2 of this and you'll feel better. Okay? The medical system was without any suggestion beyond the one it gave. Everybody go home, close your doors, and don't get infected. If you get sick, don't go to the hospital. If you think you're dying, give a call and we'll tell you what to do. This was not because they were careless or anything else. It was they were struggling to understand what their options were, how to manage this. And they fell to a strategy as a short-term strategy that made a great deal of sense. The problem with the strategy was that it became a permanent policy. And as a permanent policy, it has unintended consequences that the medical module doesn't have to worry about. And the first one, of course, was economic. The economic system first faced a financial problem, and the president, the political system that oversees all these modules, intervened as one expected. The core problem we have now is, are we having a recession or a depression? Now, the term recession was originated, I think, in the Eisenhower years, when Eisenhower didn't admit that they wanted to have a depression, so he invented the word recession. But there is, from a geopolitical point of view, a fundamental difference between the two. A recession is merely a financial crisis. Now, in this audience, I should not say merely in front of a financial crisis, but from the geopolitical point of view, these things come and go, and 2008 was a road bump. Yeah, you lost some money, we didn't, because we're poor, and so on. Okay. A depression is a place where the supply chain breaks and can't be stabilized. The example I use, which is a very bad one, is suppose you're selling razor blades, and the factory that makes razor blade holders goes out of business, and all their employees are scattered to the winds. Well, you're no longer in the razor blade business. So the supply chain is an enormously complex thing. Just go take a look at Amazon. Amazon is a supply chain company. It produces nothing. It markets what other people do and then delivers it. Well, now you go to there and try to get a thermometer, which I tried to do, and I got one in 3 weeks, airmailed from China. So when Amazon, its supply chain begins to teeter, you can imagine what the lesser supply chains are looking like. What happened to the Great Depression was not a financial crisis, and I have my apologies to Milton Friedman, who is not a relative. It was a supply chain crisis where workers became disconnected to factories, if you will. The factories became disconnected from their customers, not just financially, that as well, but also in terms of physical access. The cities broke down. The countryside, which was suffering a massive breakdown in agriculture, couldn't ship products. So what we are looking at here is the question, look, are we looking at a financial problem? If so, the government will print more money. People who don't like inflation will say this is the end of the world. People who like inflation will say, isn't this a wonderful ship to be on? And we'll go on. If, on the other hand, the supply chain is broken, if it can't be put together at this high level of unemployment that we're experiencing and that's surging, the contraction in the GDP, which represents not a financial problem, but a contraction in the economy itself, then we have a very different problem. And what we have experienced here is that the medical community was given authority over the disease initially and found a solution which, from a medical point of view, was perfectly reasonable. From an economic point of view, is somewhere tottering on catastrophe. The political structure above all this is looking at two problems. One, if it says we have to open up the city and get it back to work, every person who dies is going to blame me. Trump is desperately trying to find a way to end this situation. And he is being attacked. As he's a president, he gets attacked. And he's just bothered, but he is trying to say, look, we can't go beyond May 1st. And what he's really saying there is, I don't know where the line is, but somewhere we're going to start breaking things badly. Things that can't be put together readily. And about May, I'm going to be facing the need for another tenth of the US economy, the GDP, to be monetized. He's already monetized 1/10 of the economy to attempt to cushion the processes. And he bought himself some short-term solutions, their bureaucracy notwithstanding. He doesn't want to monetize another tranche, and he really doesn't want to do a third one. So his thinking is, if we can open the economy and get it back before it breaks irrevocably, and I throw another 10% of the GDP into it, okay, we'll get back there. If I'm not going to do it for another 3 months, it's going to break so badly I can't get it back together. Now we have a battle between Fauci, representing the learned medical community, and the president. And the tension between them is Fauci's job is to find a medical solution. And the medical module operates on the principle of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And as a result, it is maintaining the processes it had beforehand, which is we are going to test the vaccine for 1.5 years, and we are not going to release any possible medication until it's been proven to be efficacious and non-harmful. We're going to stick to our model. And the president is looking at this. Have you lost your mind? Give me something. The worst that can happen is we'll kill some people. They're dying anyway. Give me some medical solutions. This is where all eyes turn to Fort Detrick, or those eyes that know that Fort Detrick is there. Because Fort Detrick operates not on the principle of take no risks, but on the principle of calculated risk, which is the same principle on which the economy runs. Almost all investment decisions are based on calculated risk, not zero risk. And the economic system, which Trump is representing in this case, is saying, just get me back to something where I can manage my factory, my office, and so on, and get the workers back, and so on. And the doctors are saying, we can't give you anything now. So there is research taking place in the military. In this debate, there's the one segment that hasn't been heard of, the social. One of the extraordinary things in the United States has been the discipline and willingness with which the public has accepted quarantine. Americans are generally cowboys. I live in Texas, and this is not a theoretical statement. Uh, they don't like taking orders. It is noteworthy that they did, not merely here, but in New York City and elsewhere. Whenever breakdowns happened, the public accepted the idea that there is a crisis and we must do something about it. Okay. I don't know of any medical crisis in history that was handled this way. In polio, there was a suggestion that all children should be quarantined for the summer because that's when it spread, apparently. And society basically said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to absorb the risk. And kids got polio, and I didn't, and it was, that was the way it went. During the Spanish flu, many more people were killed, but it was right on the heels of World War I. We were used to massive casualties. Nobody was shocked. 10 million dead. We experienced that in a month of battles. Plus, we didn't understand, what it was. We never, at a moment, had a medical breakthrough. In this case, we expect to have zero risk. We've accepted that from the medical profession. They were going to give us zero risk. Now we have the economic crisis that we're facing, cushioned by modernization of the GDP. But just how many times can you go back to that then? The social problem is this. It is one thing to stay at home and feel noble and safe for 6 months, I should say 1 month. But the summer is coming. And the summer is coming, and you have 10-year-old children, and you live in an apartment in Brooklyn. One of the things that is the most distressing thing is that on a global basis, family violence has surged. Okay? My wife wants to kill me. It's understandable, but it's not new. But she doesn't try. Now they're doing it. Now, we are looking at a situation that becomes socially unsustainable. When you say there is no deadline to leaving, we will have no cure for a year and a half. We will not be able to certify anything. Stay home. You don't only have an economic breakdown. You don't head to depression. You are led into a social crisis that we've not seen before, where children can't go play with each other, that husband and wife can't get away from each other. We can't take vacation this summer. We will stay here in this apartment. Do not trivialize the psychological effect. The psychological effect has not been felt yet, but will be felt in the summer, because summer in the United States is traditionally the time when social unrest shows up. When we had the Haymarket massacre, when we had the 82nd Airborne called into Detroit, these are summertime events. And that's pretty reasonable. You're living in I live in Texas in a fairly decent spread. You guys living in apartments in Philadelphia, let's say, you have less room for maneuver, less room for privacy, less room not to hear your neighbor play for the 78th time that song that you don't want to hear anymore. And what will come out of this is they're already emerging theories of who really is at fault and conspiracy theories. I received a letter today from a reader discussing Dr. Fauci as Goebbels. Okay, there has been a discussion that the entire matter is a conspiracy by drug companies to sell more vaccines. You haven't seen anything yet. We don't go this extreme, but I'll give you this as a model to think of. The Great Depression in Germany demanded that something be done and that depression be explained. Why did this happen? The idea that this is simply an impersonal force that takes place is not satisfactory to people. And in that case, he picked the Jews. Okay, he worked and he got to work and it was fine. But do not think that we're escaping the social. We are not in the social right now, but I would say that come June, we're going to be playing in a somewhat different league, which is where the military module comes into play. The police are, if the worst case scenario, which is I'm deliberately painting now, comes to bear, then you wind up in a situation where the local police can no longer handle it. Now, we've not militarized the American law enforcement. I really since the Civil War, when we passed a law saying it was illegal. But that is a standby force for stabilization. Now, if I make this sound more extreme than it is quite extreme and probably won't be nearly as extreme as I'm saying, but it has to be understood what the risks are. There are risks in vaccines. There are risks in the financial markets. But nowhere are the towering risks higher than in the social community. Now, it follows from this logically that we're going to have to break social quarantines shortly. We don't have much time. And the president, just before I walked in here, came up with a statement saying, okay, the governors are responsible for ending the thing. And a very smart move says, you guys are responsible. But it's very clear that he wants to end it because we got into it in a kind of confusing way. Now, other countries are also in the process of finding ways to end it. But the problem is that the Germans have a very good way. The virus itself is deadly, but not as deadly, not nearly as deadly as other viruses have been. This is a virus which spreads rapidly, makes you very sick, and a certain percentage, which we can't quite figure out because we don't know who's affected, die. Okay. Well, we've faced diseases of this sort. The question is that society has to decide, do we end the quarantine and accept the casualties, or refuse to accept the quarantine, wait for the solution for the medical, and then wind up paying the price for it? And that's a debate that's sort of been having now in the good old American way, incoherent, but that pretty much is the discussion are being held now. The world is looking at us. We are by far the overwhelming innovator of medical products. We are the ones that are as likely to come up with a comprehensive set of solutions as anyone else. And the rest of the world is, until that point, on hold. I like to say, when was the last time you heard about Brexit? It was in all the newspapers, I promise you. There are headlines, they were talking about it. How about North Korean nuclear weapons? When was the last time that was on your shopping list? And we do talk about the Russian oil deal, because that feeds into this entire thing. But we have suspended international relations. And what is going to emerge from this is a high degree of nationalism. We've entered a high degree of nationalism without even discussing it, which is, we're us, that's Canada, we're separate. But even more, if you take a look at the European Union, it's fragmented. The borders are closed. A fundamental principle of the European Union is gone. The Germans want a monetary policy that protects Germany. The Italians want one that protects Italy. And they suddenly realize, you know what? We're not all European. They're Germans, we're Italians, and the Germans control the European Central Bank. And so that discussion is being had. This was underway before. One of the forecasts we had for this year, not counting the virus, was further fragmentation of the EU and further tension between countries. The past 30 years have been odd. They existed for certain reasons, but they were not sustainable. Europe did not suddenly abolish war. The Americans did not suddenly become really nice guys who don't care who sends things to them. We are all nationalists. What comes out of this is we're all trying to respond to this crisis individually, each country by itself. There is no international, and frankly, the World Health Organization did a pretty poor job, save that everybody did a pretty poor job in handling this. They're not an exception. So we are here on our own, and we have been driven even faster than I imagined to fragmentation of the international system. And all trade agreements and everything else really depends on the condition of the American supply chain and everybody else's. We're not in depression, so therefore the hard stories I've been talking about are not extended, but we have to move very quickly, and the medical clock and the economic clock are running at different rates. Do I think we will get out of this? Yes. Do I think there are enormous risks that aren't considered always? Yes. And the medical one may not be the worst when we look back on it all. But in any case, the political decisions that are currently made are coming with the clash of these various modules between the states and the federal government, within the federal government, and they're not easily solved. We are not built for making rapid decisions. And time is going by. So we need to watch when this is released and how the public reacts to the fact there are people going to die because it's released. And then we'll find out where we are. So let me stop there and ask for questions, comments, violent outbursts, whatever.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, George. So we're going to open it up to Q&A. Just as a reminder, in the go-to system, if you'd like to ask a question, there's a dashboard to the right-hand side of your screen. Look for the gray tab that says questions. You can open that up, type your question, that'll put it into the queue. We'll sort them here and we'll get those questions to George. Before we do that, if I could ask Colleen, let's take a look at our survey results while the questions are in the queue. I think there are some questions that we had that fit in nicely with some of the comments that George had. So in terms of interdependent, 59% saying less interdependent versus 41. Next question. So it looks like in the last week, 67% of you have been out to get supplies. The end of social distancing and business closure. So pretty evenly split between the next 2 months. George, to your comment, July, August, about 30% and 25% believe the fourth quarter of this year, and not an insignificant number, the first quarter of 2021. Okay, so it looks like a little more than half of you are working remotely, still engaged, and 30% self-employed. That's good. So 2/3 of you believe there'll be more spending on healthcare. And question 6, majority, almost 70% suggest no, there won't be an ideological shift for the president. Great, thank you for that. Okay, so let's get to some questions here. You know, we answered the audience's view of interdependent and whether it will be more or less interdependent. But George, maybe one question that frequently comes up is this: can you give some examples of where there used to be positive interdependencies? That might be between the medical and the economy modules that you're talking about. It might be between the United States and China. Where do you see positive interdependencies shifting to become negative interdependencies, or vice versa?
Well, you had a good positive interdependency between China and the United States over electronics. The maximization or minimization of cost of various things shifted by placing that production partly here and partly there. It began to wear thin when it caused knockoff effects like unemployment in the United States or began threatening American security. But I mean, that was one. Another one that's always been there is the US Canadian. The Canadians always complained about us. We never noticed them. It was a perfectly effective relationship. The two countries depended on, and they really acted as if they were two parts of the same country. Interestingly, now the border is closed. For the first time in history, the US-Canadian border is closed. I'm not sure what that means, but these are the things that will break down. But that was perfectly, a positive. A negative one was essentially the relationship between, for example, Russia and Poland in the Cold War. It was essentially a mutually exploitative relationship that both sides lost on. And, you'd have to dig into the particular things. But, on the whole, if the countries can manage their relation with other nations, they come out positive. It's when you lose the ability to manage, like the Poles did, or like in some ways the Soviets did, that it becomes a problem. So long as we're able to manage the relationship and doesn't become sacred, people say, you can't break your ties with Canada, for example. That's when the problem begins, when you get politically locked in to outmoded modes.
Good, thank you for that. There's a question here, how do you reconcile the globalization of the scientific community and the political community that's turned inwards? So one looking outwards, one being less global, not just in the US, but elsewhere. In a post-COVID era, which prevails, scientific community or the political community?
Well, clearly the political community. The political community gets elected. It gets elected by its citizens. And the citizens are now obsessed with this disease properly, and they expect performance. And a political leader has to deal with his customers. And the medical is interesting to it only to the extent it gives it a solution. Now, I don't think the United States cares if the solution comes from here or from a Japanese lab, so long as there is a solution and we can get on with business. But the essential problem here is that the medical system is not relevant to the problem we're having. It wants to be, it's dead, but the time frames are out of sync. So I think there's no question that whenever you have a trade relationship that the political system has oversight over, it has to please its voters, and will do so.
Okay. Could you just clarify the Fort Detrick reference? What is Fort Detrick's special role?
Sorry. Fort Detrick used to be head of biological warfare until 1969. It's an Army fort, and it was realized about 1969 that biological warfare is stupid because you can't aim the damn thing and it come back at you, which, if Wuhan is correct, seems to have been something like that. It then turned into the Center for Counter Biological Warfare. It's the place where the US government deals with issues like immunizations, it deals with questions such as vaccines, all sorts of things that are needed to protect the society. It is normally an outrider because nobody in the medical community likes it, but it's one that really is prepared to take risks if ordered to do so. I have no idea what they've been ordered to do so, but I'm sure they were ordered to get the damn thing out there. And we know that at Fort Detrick, this was revealed yesterday, 2 people were given a vaccine to try. They're alive. From the standpoint of Fort Detrick, that's quite enough. They're not dead, we can use it. But these guys are used to emergency conditions, and they're used to syncing with political and other realities. And so I've been watching them, and the interesting thing is, there's no news about them. But I happen to know that the Secretary of Defense went there 2 weeks ago for a briefing. Secretary of the Army, there's a constant shuttle back and forth. But the only place you find real news about it, if you're the outside, is there's a local newspaper run by a colonel's wife. And she knows who comes, and she publishes it. And if you dig that up, you'll find out what's going on.
Very, very good. Thank you for that. There's a whole host of questions here regarding supply chains and your comments to supply chains. What does it mean for or what happens to supply chains after the COVID problem is behind us? Do they shorten? How do you see that playing out?
Well, consider what a supply chain to your supermarket is. It begins on a farm, is moved to a packing plant, is moved to a general wholesaler, is then moved to your supermarket's warehouse, is then put on your shelves. These work, they're much more complicated, but these work automatically, continually, and properly. Now, suddenly, the workers aren't there. And you can start seeing it in your supermarket, they're bare shelves. And if you look at bare shelves and not bare shelves, and you ask this question, they all know it, the bare shelves, our supply chain is broken down. It's a warehouse or somewhere in the system that's not working. Or demand has gotten so high they can't adjust. The ones that are working are there. So you'll find your supermarket, some shelves bare, some not. Now, the question is, somebody's got to live. And if you say to somebody, come back in 3 months and I'll get a job for you as a loader or a packer or driving a truck or whatever, all the things that are necessary in this, they can't do that. They normally are fairly close to their paycheck. And so what you can wind up doing in this particular case is two things. First, you lose your workers, and recruiting others, the hours you need and everything else is a time-consuming thing. But second, there are precision instruments that work here that need maintenance. For example, the weighing packing process is something to behold. Think of the country as 50,000 supply chains. It's more. Each of them a precision instrument, all of them requiring constant maintenance and attention, and you leave it go for 3 months. Well, you can get it back going, but you're going to add to 2 or 3 more months. And the more that you have this disruption, the more your customers are going to go someplace else to get whatever they need. Because remember, at the end of this is a customer. Now, some you're going to have to buy no matter what, but I have bought more useless things from Amazon than I knew existed, and they always showed up in one day. And Amazon's great pledge was if you're a Prime customer, they'll get it to you in a day. Then it became 2 days. It's now, we'll get it to you when we get it to you. Keep in touch. Just look at that and then imagine the pharmaceutical supply chain, which is a very sensitive one in the sense that they operate with clean rooms, with precision. Accidents can't be done, accepted. And you've got people at home or people refusing to come in or something like that. So the knock-on effect of disrupting the supply chain is that it deteriorates in odd ways. And resurrecting it is hard. It can be done, but by then the financial basis of the company may be completely wiped out. And that's when it's depression.
So to that point, tying it back to the example of whether it's a thermometer, certainly pharmaceutical manufacturing that takes place, critical manufacturing that takes place in China. How do you see the medical supply chain shifting, if at all?
Well, at this point, the United States is going to maintain purchasing, but there's a political problem. We can't both see China as dangerous medically, but we're going to buy all our drugs there. I mean, we can say that, but I suspect that we're going to be looking at these dependencies very carefully, not just the medical dependency. Should we be so dependent on a country for a critical thing? Now, right now, we allow the market to decide where to go. Nobody's going to tell you not to go. But what's going to happen is more of a Cold War attitude. In the Cold War attitude, we don't want to be buying our oil from Russia. Or we don't want this country taken over and we have to intervene. We've been looking at it, what people normally think of as geopolitically, which is a subset of it, which is basically how much power do you want to give another state over yourself? Now, in China, it's mixed. We buy their stuff, they really need the money. On the other hand, They have a lever over us. The question that I can't possibly answer, I don't know enough, is how long would a transfer take place? Or are we locked in?
Okay. Not surprising, a whole host of political questions here. Here's a quick one and then maybe a slightly longer one. The quick one is, couldn't the states governors really create the policy and then have the feds, Washington, D.C., get on board?
That's
And
exactly what Trump wants,
hmm,
because they'll also be blamed when they screw up. This is dangerous stuff. It's not going to be, oh, it's safe. It'll be follow on epidemics and so on and so forth. So what he wants is that they should. Oh, somebody told him. He said, "No, no, no. I've got to do it. I got to do it." And somebody said to him, "Look, listen to me. You open it, you're blamed. Let them open it. They break it, they live with it." And so they'll grab it because at this point they have no choice. But we don't even understand what oversight means. I mean, we've opened it up. One scenario, the only one I can see, is people start getting sick and running to the hospital, and the hospital's overwhelmed, and we stop it. Or somebody knows something that I don't about how to make this virus less aggressive.
and then what do you think that the current environment means for the November election?
I've thought about this a great deal, and the answer is I don't know. Haven't a clue. It really depends. I mean, Trump can come out of this an absolute hero and win by 80%. He can be arrested and shot. I have no idea how this plays out, but that will determine a great deal of the election. There's even some talk about trying to postpone the election or having election by mail or something like that. So I can't begin to predict.
Okay. Do you see any, maybe back to that ideological view for both parties, do you see anything changing with regard to views on government role, the view on taxes, the view on regulation as a result of the pandemic?
I think as we come out of this, what will be investigated is the medical community and how it reacts to crises and how it anticipates them. The question of how the economy runs really raises the question of what is the vulnerability of the supply chain? What kind of redundancy do we require? I think regulation will shift, from regulating the purity of this particular product to raising the question of, in particular sets of products, do we have the redundancy that can replace the supply chain? I think we've always talked about supply chain. It's a wonderful way to discuss it and sound like you know what you're doing. I do it all the time. But the way I think we're going to look at this is take a look at what happened here and start looking at that. I'm not sure either the Republican or the Democrat approach to these things is relevant after this. The ideological questions change, but it really depends how it ends or if it ends to be able to forecast that. In other words, I can tell you exactly what will happen after it happens.
With perfect certainty. What's the chance of, two questions here that are related. What's changed as a result of the pandemic that makes the potential outcome so extreme? And one question here is defining an extreme outcome as a major world war. What's the probability of that?
That's a nasty one because historically, events like this in multiple countries did lead to extreme friction. The Depression, which started in Europe, went to the United States, affected the Japanese, you can trace back the war, but I don't see any of that here. I don't see any issues that are driven by it, nor is there any level of appetite. What emerged there was a solution to Germany that involved regarding the rest of the world as evil. One of the things that really will be interesting as we get the conspiracy theories, do any of them trigger a political response? Do any of them make them go from that to that? Not just in this country, but in a bunch of other countries. So at this point, I would have to say that while the model says, yeah, there's going to be conflict, the way I look at the model and take it apart, I don't see that happening.
Okay, thank you. You write a lot about borders, and you mentioned the U.S. relationship with our friends to the north. What about the U.S. relationship with our friends to the south when you think about Mexico and how this might change relationships between the United States and Mexico?
Well, I regard Mexico as a very serious country. It is the 13th largest economy in the world. It's a very diffuse divide and so on, but it's not Speedy Gonzales country anymore. You go down to Querétaro, you see Airbus, Bombardier, all sorts of aircraft plants. You go to Aguascalientes, you see the largest auto assembly plant in the Western Hemisphere. So we have had a fixation on immigration, which normally comes from lower classes, okay, while missing the emergence of a Mexican middle class and a fairly wealthy country. The Mexicans have a long-term grievance against the United States. We stole northern Mexico square and fair, had a war, took it away, and they really want it back. They haven't forgotten. So in the long run, decades, the question becomes clear. In the shorter run, as much as we talk about immigration, the illegal immigrants come to the United States because we want them to, because they get here, they get jobs, and we need them. So the strategy of the United States is to condemn illegal immigration in every way they can, so long as they don't interfere with it, so long as it happens. We have a very complex relationship, but there's a difference between Canada and Mexico, which is Canada is there. It is not what I call dynamic geopolitically. It's not about the seas west Washington State. Mexico is a much more dynamic and unpredictable country because it has developed so rapidly over the past 10, 15 years. And it actually, I think, is doing fairly well in this crisis. And the immigrants are staying home and they're getting jobs. And so I think the problem of Mexico is that this crisis will further make it impossible for the United States to come to terms with just how serious and dangerous the country it is, and what makes it dangerous, which is not immigration.
So there's a long list of questions about China, some things that you've mentioned about China. Maybe we can boil these down into two core questions. And one is just if you could elaborate on what you said about President Xi facing opposition in China, and maybe talk a little bit about just this week alone, we've heard a recurrence of the hypothesis that maybe COVID-19 was generated in a lab as opposed to a market. And do you have any commentary on that?
And the first one, the president of China has one major job: to keep the American president in line. China depends desperately on the American markets. It loves to bluff itself as a major military power and all this. But the basic thing you have to do is control the president to keep it. Well, Donald Trump doesn't get controlled. And the worst thing that could happen to China happened: tariffs. It was already smashed in 2008, its exports. This one really squeezed harder. He lost control of Hong Kong, which was a major thing. Xinjiang, he made no progress in South China Sea. So we thought even before this happened that Xi was in political trouble, that there were elements in the Central Committee that wanted to find an excuse to get him out. I don't know how you could handle this virus worse than he did. I mean, yeah, you can declare what a great guy I am, but China has a political system like any other. Xi dropped the ball on a whole bunch of issues before this. Nobody wants to get rid of him because it's stabilizing. This didn't go well. Somebody's going to pay for it. Okay, it's either Xi's going to shoot a lot of people or he's going to get shot. Somebody has to answer for this in China. So I think, he's in deep trouble. What was the other question? Sorry.
About the source of the virus itself, whether it was man-made or natural or some combination.
Well, one thing I believe is it was not intentionally released because it's really stupid to kill all these people. That's not how you attack the United States. Okay, they had a lab insanely located in the middle of a major city. Okay, Fort Detrick is in the middle of goddamn nowhere, and no one ever builds anything. This lab is in the middle of the city. Could it have been one? That's what they do in these labs. They invent viruses and cure them. That's what the game is. So it's certainly possible. I've never quite understood. I've been to China. I've seen the wet markets and everything else. I saw it disgusting, but I don't see inherently why it produces viruses. It may, but I think it'll kill you some other way before then. So could it happen? Yes. Could they have lied about it? Certainly. Could they have given us, the world, more information about what they had about the virus? That was almost certainly. That's the point where they get blamed. Everybody's screwed around with this stuff, but they get blamed if they knew that virus escaped and they didn't rush technical information on the nature of the virus to every lab in the world so they get busy on it. Okay, and there'll be something to pay. And the World Health Organization did not clearly distribute the information that it had. That's politically proper, I think.
Hmm.
It played a role in this. So there are questions to answer, but at this point, what comes out of it would be an anti-Chinese feeling. But right now, the president gets very little to gain out of finding fault with the Chinese. Because right now he's on trial. Either his presidency is being on trial right now. So far, so good. But he can screw it up in a day. So that's not where it's going.
Okay. We have time for just two more questions. This one is within the risk framework, given that we've had places like the Javits Center, we've had some FEMA and military buildup of facilities. Does the political and medical risk consideration change because of the military's input and what they've been able to affect with some of the actions they've taken in the last month?
At this point, their intervention has been purely logistical, medical. They're not under their own command. They are under control of the hospitals. The basic problem is this. The virus is a problem. It's not that deadly. It kills older people with preconditions, some minor. But compared to cholera or diphtheria or other things, which we live with, okay, the disease itself isn't that sensitive, but our culture is hypersensitive to any disease. So by saying that academically is interesting, but of no concern, everybody gets concerned. I don't think the military being involved at this point in any way shifts the risk-reward ratio. Where it may shift it is in finding medicines and deploying them to soldiers. The people who were tested were both volunteers, soldiers, and I can imagine the sergeant volunteering them. There's where it may happen, but what they're doing but think of that as supply chain. This is where the military could intervene in the supply chain if it breaks down. They have the manpower, they have the expertise, they have trucks. It can happen, and that's what some place like Javits Center was, a pure supply chain.
Great. George, final question. Could you just maybe, based on everything you've said and the research that you're doing, how would you summarize your top three takeaways based on what we know today?
For all the best efforts of the medical community, there will still be diseases, and people will have to devise ways to live with it. It's not going to go away. My second thing is, don't expect governments to have miracles. They're just guys, gals hanging out, and they're as baffled as you are, but they have to pretend that they're not. Finally, and I think this is the most important, the extreme efficiency built into the American economy has made it incredibly vulnerable. The more efficient the supply chain, the less exogenous parts, the more it can be hit by something. So efficiency has as its price vulnerability. And what we may see, and I hope not, is that vulnerability exploited by the crisis at a breakdown. So one of the things we really have to have a talk about, and companies will come out of this, I think, thinking about this and say, okay, I've got a beautiful supply chain that's really efficient, saves me a tremendous amount of money. Now, where's my second one? And that'll cost a lot more money.
Great. And George, we're going to have to leave it there. That will conclude our Q&A. If you had a question in the queue that didn't get asked, the GIC staff will make every attempt to follow up with you, but we appreciate some really great questions. George, thank you for an excellent presentation, really thoughtful insights, and there's a lot for us in the audience to digest. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at geopoliticalfutures.com website, where you can see George and his team and the research and the analysis that they provide. Feel free to check out the book, The Storm Before the Calm. And to all of you, we appreciate your attention and participating today. The GIC is proud to present this as a public service to friends and family of the GIC, if you will. However, we should remind that we are a non-for-profit organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based in Philadelphia. We'd love to be able to continue this programming with generous donations and support from individuals like yourselves or corporations. So please take a look and check out the GIC's website at www.interdependence.com. So on behalf of all of us at the GIC, we thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you.